Of all the covenants in the Old Testament, the covenant with Abraham is foundational for the existence of Israel as the people of God. So I'd like to focus on this foundational covenant. I feel like this foundational covenant is the bottom line for Israel. Since it is a covenant of grace, it applies and it still stands even when the people of Israel are faithless to God. God remains committed to them. Amazing reality. Now, just covenant and God's covenant with Abraham, much of this you've already had. I'll go through what I think you should know fairly quickly and focus on probably what you are less likely to know. But if you want me to explain as I go, arrest my flow. Don't let me rush you. First of all, what's a covenant? We've already had God's foundational commands and promises. A covenant goes beyond a promise. It goes. It is a legally binding promise and therefore a commitment, the strongest kind of performative utterance possible in the Old Testament. So, for example, you can promise somebody something. I can promise that when I die, you, Tom, will inherit all my household goods. It's not worth very much, but it'll help you out a bit. However, you wouldn't be very impressed by a promise that I made, but you would become very impressed if you could read a will that I'd drawn out in which I'd bequeathed everything to you. Same promise, what's the difference? A covenant, which is the last will and testament, is legally binding. A legally binding promise, a legally binding commitment. Now, in the Old Testament, the covenants are foundational. They are not just relevant for the people involved, but they're foundational for all those who that person represents. So when God makes a covenant with Noah, it's just not with Noah and his family, but it's also all human beings, all animals. When God makes a covenant with Abraham, he makes that covenant with all his descendants. When God makes a covenant with David, it's not just David, but he makes a covenant with all his household, his dynasty, and all his the kings who come after David as descendants of David on the throne of David. Right? So it is a foundational enactment, a covenant. You get two kinds of covenants. Scholars, at least for the last, since from about 1950, when covenants became very fashionable in Old Testament scholarship, to about 1980, were quite often distinguished between unilateral covenants and bilateral covenants. Now, this is not exactly terminologically precise, because all covenants are always bilateral. But what's meant is whether the covenant is based on a unilateral commitment or a bilateral commitment. So, for example, a last will and testament is bilateral. It's between me and my kids, basically. But the commitment is one-sided. I commit myself to give my property to my kids. Right? So the commitment is unilateral. However, when I got married, I entered a covenant which was bilateral in the sense that both Claire and I entered into commitments with each other. And you see, it's not a question of whether the covenant's one-sided or two-sided, but whether the commitment is one-sided or two-sided. In the Old Testament, we have unilateral covenants, 3 of them, or maybe 4 of them. There's one that is not much mentioned. There's God's covenant with Noah, unilateral commitment of God. There's God's covenant with Abraham, unilateral, although it does involve Abraham circumcising himself and his son Isaac, even Ishmael. So it involves circumcision. So scholars have questioned whether you can talk about that as unilateral. commitment. But circumcision is not commitment to God, but it's entering into receiving God's commitment. Then the third very important unilateral covenant is God's covenant with David and his seed, his descendant. There maybe is a fourth, which is God's covenant to the priests. Is spoken about as a covenant. However, that doesn't feature very prominently. And then there are two bilateral covenants, which are very, very important. There's God's covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. God commits himself to Israel and then gives them the Ten Commandments as their commitment to him. And then you have the covenant, if you can call about a separate covenant, with Israel at the plains of Moab. God promises to give them the land, and then he demands a commitment of them in the land. He gives them the land and its blessings. However, the blessings and the land will be lost if they worship other gods. So the first commandment is foundational to the covenant on the plains of Moab. Now, since covenant theology has been very fashionable and still remains very fashionable in Old Testament scholarship and in Protestant theology, it's important that we get it exactly right. You may or may not be aware that covenant theology has traditionally been the centre of theology coming from Calvin. If there's three big themes in Calvin's theology, it's the sovereignty of God, the kingship of God, secondly, predestination, and thirdly, covenants. So covenant theology is foundational to a Reformed way of thinking. It takes the place of law and gospel in Lutheran theology. Covenant theology. I don't want to go into a critique of it and so on. The place to do that is in your systematic theology. And as always, there's an element of truth. So as a result of, the last 50 years, there's been a fight back from Old Testament scholarship against liberalism, and a large amount of the arguments that were based against the the attack on the historicity of the Old Testament and the whole notion of revelation has come from scholars who've used arguments about the covenant to mount their case. And it's been a very impressive case. And as a result of it, a lot of work's been done, a huge amount of work's been done, and the temptation is to put everything into covenant mode. So, for example, if you read what's the standard Old Testament theology, Contours of Old Testament Theology by senior man, one of your set texts, secondary level, it'll come in a minute. Basically, the whole of that theology is around covenants. However, it's a very liberal notion of covenant, not your classical Calvinist notion of covenant. Now, one of the very helpful articles on covenant is in the Dictionary of Old Testament Theology by a Jewish scholar who did a lot of background work in the Middle East about covenants, not in the Old Testament, but covenants in other societies. And he points out a very interesting fact. He says that God's covenant with Abraham was very much like a royal land grant to a faithful official in the ancient world. And it wasn't only in the ancient world, but it went all the way through the Middle Ages up to Elizabethan England and beyond. Let's say I was a king, and you, Michael, were my courtier, a general in my army. I will reward you for the services that you rendered to me by giving you some royal land in one of two ways, either just for you or as freehold in perpetuity. And that would be giving you a title. So you would become Lord Michael of Whoop Whoop. What I'd give you is a piece of land that belonged to me. Very often I'd conquered it from somebody else, but I'd give you that land, and I'd give you all the serfs on the land, everything that had to do with that land, and that would be your land in perpetuity, and the title your lordship would indicate that that land belonged to your family, your descendants hereafter, forever. Right? So do you get the basic thing? Somebody works for a king. They've served with distinction. The king rewards that person not by giving them a pension. No pensions in the ancient world were possible, or just by paying them money, which is dubious. What you do with money, what you do with $1 million, you've got to invest it somehow, and that's very difficult in the ancient world. But you reward somebody for services rendered by giving them land. Now, the closest you get to covenants, the covenant with Abraham, is covenants that kings made with their officials in that circumstances. Now, as always, what happens here is that the Old Testament takes something and turns it on its head. Because, it's true that Abraham is God's servant. Now, by the way, servant, watch out whenever the word servant is used, both Old Testament, New Testament. So when Paul says he is a servant of Christ, doesn't mean primarily that he's a slave of Christ. It could be that. Servant can mean one of three things. It can mean just worker. So my servant is the person who works for me. In modern terms, then, it's employee. So servant, most commonly, is employee. Now, as a special kind of employee, you get slaves. Okay, they're employees. However, there's many cases in the Old Testament where somebody is a servant, which doesn't mean that they're workers or slaves, but it means that they are somebody's deputy. So Eliezer is the servant of Abraham. He is the manager of Abraham's family, his estate, all his property. He is his CEO, Chief Executive Officer. He's his manager. He's the oikonomos, the steward of the house of Abraham. David is the servant of the Lord, which means that he is the deputy of God. Not slave of God, but he's God's deputy. He is his prime minister. So in what way is Abraham the first servant of the Lord in the Old Testament? It means that he is God's deputy. He is God's agent, representative here on earth. If you think in royal terms, then he is God's prime minister here on earth. Now, and this is where things get a little bit unusual. Usually, if a king would call a servant, he'd call a man at what period of life? As a boy. So you get maximum service. So you can shape him, mould him as a courtier. Now, instead of calling Abraham when he was 20 years old or 15 years old, he calls Abraham when he's an old codger, an old dodderer, right? 90 years old, I think he is, when he's called, isn't it? No, that's when he has a child. What? 75 yes. So 75, that's well beyond retirement. So he calls Abraham to be his servant at the age where he's of no use, from a human point of view, an old man. And he doesn't give him a reward, which is the covenant, the offer of the land, as a reward for services, because he's done nothing. But he gives in view of Abraham's faith, and so that he can secure his service. So the call comes first. The land is given right at the beginning before service, so that he can secure the services of Abraham so that he can finance him so that Abraham can be his servant. Yes, Murray?
So is that where we get the saying that you get more busy in retirement than you're
I'm not too sure about that, but that's scaring me at this stage of my life. He's the servant of the Lord. Now take notice of that, that's very important. And this is mentioned again and again in the book of Isaiah. My servant Abraham is a stock title. Now, so it's not given as a reward for service, but because of the faith of Abraham. Vaughan, can you read the critical passage, chapter 15, 4-6 of Genesis?
Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness.
Keep going up to verse 7.
And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it.
Okay. I brought you out to give you this land to possess it. It's received then because of the faith of Abraham, and that faith is reckoned as righteousness. It's not the service that's reckoned as righteousness, but the faith is reckoned as righteousness. And because of that, then God promises them his heir and land. Now, normally a king would not give a title to a man who didn't have any children, quite obviously. Why?
Because the children couldn't get the title.
Because there's no one to hand the land on to, and there's going to be a lot of fighting going on as to who gets the land when this man dies. Likewise, the king would very rarely employ a man who had no children because it's not cost effective. If you, say if I employ you, Damien, and reward you, then I don't only secure your services, but I also secure the services of your whole family in perpetuity. So as a king, my descendants then will have you as our workers. You'll be on our side, and we'll secure the services of your family in perpetuity. That's part of the deal. So God gives the land to Abraham, promises the land to Abraham, even though he has no heir, and not as a reward for service, but because of the faith of Abraham. Now, what was the service that God required of Abraham? Here comes something funny. We've had something already, which is to be a blessing. Now, this is spelled out in a sentence which is very often overlooked, but is far-reaching. Chris, can you go to chapter 17, verses 1? No, just verse 1. Have I?
Abraham was 99 years old. The Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me in this place.
Now, there you have it. There's two imperatives. Remember, we've had two imperatives. So go and be a blessing. Now you get two new ones. Walk before me and be blameless. Now, the English translation here that gives no indication of the weight of what God is commissioning Abraham to be. Now notice here, first of all, lefanai, walk isn't just before me, but walk in my presence. God gives Abraham access to his face, his panim, his presence. Who is the one person who has unrestricted access to the presence of a king in the ancient world? His deputy. That's the only person. Even the other children don't have unrestricted access, but his deputy has open access. Now, notice here that you get the hithpa'el of halach. So to walk is halach, but this is the hithpa'el. It's very hard to give any way of putting that in English. Walk in and out of my presence is the closest you could be. Now, this idiom, to walk in and out in my presence, is royal idiom, is the language that was used for the deputy of a king, the prime minister. So, what is Abraham to be? He is to be God's deputy, and he has access to God. He is to walk in and out. Now, the walk in and out goes two ways. You have king, you have Abraham, and then you have others. Abraham walks in, he walks out. He represents, brings the needs of other people to to God, and then he brings God's decisions, God's provisions from God to others. Now, normally in the Old Testament, which person is put in this position between God and people? Either a prophet or a priest. A prophet in a restricted sense, going in, interceding and bringing God's word out to others. But in a broader sense, it's what the priest does. The high priest does every day, comes into God's presence, interceding for the people and bringing God's blessing from God's presence to the people. So it's a kind of, just this language would be that he is appointing Abraham to be either a prophet or a priest as his deputy. But the second command pins it down, and be tamim. Now, tamim means blameless, and it means ritually blameless. Before an animal could be offered to God, it had to be tamim. What did it mean? Tamim means. Now, tam means whole, intact, in perfect condition. Nothing wrong with it. Without blemish. So, and it's not primarily a moral term, but it's a ritual term. Be without any ritual blemish. So, it's not only that the offerings were to be tamim, but a man who was brought in a priestly family who wasn't tamim, who had some defect in his body, couldn't become a priest. Only a man who was tamim, intact, in proper condition, perfect, could become a priest. So what God is doing here is commissioning Abraham to be his deputy, to be his priestly deputy, and to live a blameless life. Not so much morally blameless, also this involves, but it means ritually blameless. The closest we could get to it in the New Covenant is good conscience. So in the New Covenant, blamelessness has to do with having a good conscience before God, rather than a bad conscience. So the covenant is granted to, notice that this introduces the confirmation of God's covenant with Abraham. What is Abraham's mission? He is to be a blessing. How does he become a blessing? By walking in and out before God, in God's presence, and by being a blameless servant, deputy of God. Tom, you spoke earlier about the priestly nature of the vocation here. This is where it comes out clearly. However, it doesn't speak about it in priestly terms overtly because there's no temple yet, there's no divine service. So blamelessness has to do now with God's command and God's promises. And the accent is on God's promises. How does Abraham serve God blamelessly? Is by enacting the promises of God. Can I say that again? How does Abraham serve God blamelessly? How does he become a good deputy, a good agent of God? Is by enacting the promises of God and everything that involves. So it's granted to Abraham so that Abraham can stand in God's service. The consequence of this is shown very clearly in the story of Abraham's intercession for Sodom and Gomorrah. I'd like to have a look at two key verses which are almost always overlooked, at least on almost all the sermons that I've heard preached on this, and I've heard many very good sermons. Verse 17, 18, 19 are overlooked. Let's read it. Nathan, pick it up at verse 17 through to 19.
The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great nation, great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him."
Just stop there. Notice here, God's talking about what he's going to do, and he's talking to his deputy. So he's briefing Abraham on what he is going to do. And this has to do with what? Not punishing people, but what? All nations of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. So this has to do with Abraham administering God's blessing on earth. And God briefs him what he's going to do so that Abraham can work with God in administering blessing here on earth. How does it work? Keep going.
For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him.
So God has chosen Abraham so that he can command his children, his household, to do what? To keep the way of the Lord, to observe the Lord's way. Another way of putting it here is to do the Lord's work, to act the way God acts. To act the way of the Lord, to do or keep the way of the Lord. And how does he keep the way of the Lord? By doing righteousness and justice. Abraham administers God's righteousness, God's justice, in order to bring blessing. What's the way of the Lord? The way of the Lord is the way of blessing. It involves judgment, but God judges in order to bless. So primarily it has to do with blessing. Abraham is to be an agent of blessing. He does God's work. He serves God by administering God's righteousness and justice. Not only in his household, but his whole household, his descendants after, for the benefit of the nations of the earth. Now, in the story that follows, how does Abraham do righteousness and justice? Can you see what comes straight after here? He intercedes for who? Sodom and Gomorrah. Notice the emphasis here, doing righteousness and justice, is not that he is an agent of retribution, but he is the agent for salvation. He intercedes for God to spare some people, at least, from Sodom and Gomorrah, that wicked city. So how does Abraham use his position with God? He administers God's righteousness and justice in order to bring blessing to all the nations of the earth. But he also uses his position with God, his access to God, to intercede for sinful people. In this case, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. He doesn't just intercede for his family. He doesn't just intercede for his relative Lot, but he intercedes for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, which in any terms, who were proverbial for wickedness in the ancient world. So he administers God's righteousness by interceding for wicked people. Now, so the result of God's choice, election of Abraham, is so that he and his seed can enact God's righteousness and justice. I'd like you, for homework, if you haven't done that already, to have a very close look at Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. where we have the enactment of the covenant with Abraham in two stages.